This is the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast, brought to you by Heather Rose Jones. The show looks at lesbian and sapphic themes in history and literature, and historical fiction with queer female characters, including fantastic versions of the past. We present research, interviews, news of the field, book listings, and original historical fiction for your enjoyment. For even more historic research, check out our blog. I don't know if anyone else has noticed, but pirate novels have been getting rather popular in lesbian and sapphic fiction. Going by my spreadsheet, which isn't necessarily complete, and searching on cover copy that includes the word pirate or piracy, after a long period with only 1 to 3 pirate books each year, the numbers started climbing in 2022 and hit 16 titles in 2025. While maybe half fall within the golden age of piracy, stretching from the late 17th century to the mid-18th, and set primarily in and around the Caribbean, another solid chunk have stretched that era into the 19th century, or exist in the nebulous, timeless pirate era of Hollywood movies. There were, of course, female pirates in history, many of whom would make excellent subjects for historical fiction. From the bloodthirsty Jeanne de Clisson in 14th century Brittany, to Grania Nivali in 16th century Ireland, to the powerful commander of the Red Flag Fleet in 19th century China, Zheng Yishao. There are plenty of colorful figures to provide inspiration. The Wikipedia article on Women in Piracy has extensive listings with reliable assessments of historicity. Rather less reliable is a popular book titled Women Pirates and the Politics of the Jolly Roger by Ulrike Klausmann, Marion Meinzerin, and Gabrielle Kuhn, which aims more at entertainment and speculation. Now, it isn't quite fair to blame Hollywood for the familiar version of Golden Age piracy. Indeed, there is a long tradition of pirate stories being based primarily on a fantasy version of history, invented by someone who was most likely already a prolific novelist, who gave the public what they wanted in the form of elaborate, bloody, and largely fictionalized stories of real-life pirates, and some pirates who never existed in the first place. And at the center of that fiction are 2 real-life women pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Bonny and Read are the darlings of the lesbian pirate set, but almost everything that makes them of interest, everything except that they were women and were pirates, is fictitious. The fantasy version of the Golden Age of piracy was the creation of a man writing under the pen name Captain Charles Johnson, but whom many scholars believe to have been Daniel Defoe, author of Robinson Crusoe, Moll Flanders, A Journal of the Plague Year, and Memoirs of a Cavalier. The full title of the work, following the expansive fashion of the times, is A General History of the Pirates, from their first rise and settlement in the island of Providence to the present time, with the remarkable actions and adventures of the 2 female pirates, Mary Read and Anne Bonny, to which is added a short abstract of the statute on civil law in relation to piracy. Phew. The first edition, published early in 1724, covered 16 pirate captains, with Bonny and Read's stories included under Captain Rackham, and was so popular that a second edition was published a few months later, which included a second volume with an additional 15 biographies and further details about the people covered in the first volume. Supposedly, the second volume was aided by contributions of material from correspondents who had access to first-hand knowledge, but it includes several figures who are entirely invented. And like the material in the first volume, it includes detailed personal histories with content that could not plausibly have been obtained under the conditions in which it was written. The vast majority of the material about Bonny and Read falls in this category, including detailed histories of their childhood and early careers that could not have been available to the supposed author, whoever he was. If you want to read the complete original material and an analysis of its possible veracity, there's a multi-part series of posts on the Lesbian Historic Motif Project blog that will be linked in the show notes. But let's step back a moment. Anne Bonny and Mary Read were genuine historical figures. Their presence and activities among the crew of Jack Rackham during acts of piracy in the later part of 1720 are documented in contemporary legal records and newspapers, as is their trial for piracy, complete with detailed eyewitness accounts. From an official record published by the government of Jamaica covering a whole series of piracy trials in the latter part of 1720 and early 1721, and published sometime around May 1721. The trial records and eyewitness statements document that Bonny and Reed participated enthusiastically and violently in acts of piracy, that they did so while wearing masculine clothing, that they were found guilty and sentenced to hang, and that they successfully delayed execution by claiming pregnancy. This was a common tactic for female defendants, as execution would be put off until either the child was born or it was demonstrated the claim was not true, and the delay could allow time for appeals or clemency. In contrast to the general history's claim that Bonny and Reed were successfully disguised as men during their time on the ship, their true sex unknown to anyone except each other and Captain Rackham, the eyewitnesses indicated it was perfectly obvious they were women, and furthermore, that they only dressed in masculine clothing during combat while wearing skirts at other times. But I get a little ahead of myself. The myth of lesbian pirates derives from one episode in the general history that depends entirely on the motif of a completely successful gender disguise. I'll quote the passage in full. It comes during the biography of Mary Read. Her sex was not so much as suspected by any person on board, till Anne Bonny, who was not altogether so reserved in point of chastity, took a particular liking to her. In short, Anne Bonny took her for a handsome young fellow, and for some reasons best known to herself, first discovered her sex to Mary Read. Mary Read, knowing what she would be at, and being very sensible of her own incapacity that way, was forced to come to a right understanding with her. And so, to the great disappointment of Anne Bonny, she let her know she was a woman also. But this intimacy so disturbed Captain Rackham, who was the lover and gallant of Anne Bonny, that he grew furiously jealous, so that he told Anne Bonny he would cut her new lover's throat. Therefore, to quiet him, she let him into the secret also. Now, it's an important bit of context that gender disguise adventures were a popular staple of 17th and 18th century popular culture. And there's a common motif of a woman in male disguise on shipboard falling into sexual adventures because a woman, usually the captain's wife, is attracted to someone she thinks is a handsome young man. While this motif flirts with the idea of same-sex relations, it's done with plausible deniability, as the desiring person believes they are pursuing an opposite-sex encounter, and the revelation of the underlying sex immediately puts an end to the desire. That said, the historic record does include a good number of successful gender disguise biographies, and that's only the ones we know about because they failed at some later point, including ones where a disguised woman either initiates or goes along with a romantic or sexual relationship with a woman, either to support the disguise or from desire. We can't always tell. So the fictional version of Bonny and Reed's encounter, that they were both successfully passing as men and engaged in a same-sex flirtation within that context, is quite plausible. But the totality of the evidence for the real Bonny and Reed's lives makes it clear that no such encounter happened between them. They were not successfully passing as men. They weren't even trying to. Even within the narratives offered by the general history, the only source for the slightest hint of sapphic attraction, they are both depicted as exclusively heterosexual, both pursuing sexual relationships with fellow male pirates. So, how did Bonny and Reed end up becoming the darlings of the lesbian pirate movement? For that, we need to trace the history of the genre. Historian Helen Rodriguez is joining the podcast to talk about the pop culture afterlife of Bonny and Reed, and especially how they became lesbian icons. Welcome, Helen. So why don't you start by giving us a little bit of your background?
Okay, well, my name is Helen Rodriguez. I am a historian as of this week, actually. I got my degree finally sent me in the mail from Columbus State. I started off as a writer for a YouTube channel called Debunk File that was mostly just like mystery videos. At one point, they asked me, "Oh, let's do a pirate story. Those are fun." And so I was just like, "Oh, why don't we do like, buried treasure, William Kidd, that kind of thing." And none of that kind of stuck. So I said, "Well, what about Anne Bonny, that female pirate? Because I'm aware of her. I've played the old Assassin's Creed games and seen Black Sails, and I'm well aware that her actual fate's kind of unclear." I started, going through Google, going through Smithsonian articles and other facets, and I thought, okay, I have a pretty good, grasp on the subject. And then I found an article about from the South Carolina Post and Courier that basically said, actually, no, everything you're reading is probably wrong, and explained in good detail why it's wrong. I went, oh, I see. Well, I'll just start over and start researching different things. I had to get a few books, and the whole summer just dragged on into the fall, and eventually, by complete chance, I managed to find a document from, I think it was FamilySearch.com. That was the burial record for an Anne Bonny, 1733, December of the 29th, I believe. And to this day, I feel fairly confident, although not beyond all shadow of a doubt, that is probably the actual burial record of the pirate because it's in Jamaica. That led to an article in the South Carolina Post and Courier, and that video finally came out like November 28th, the 300th anniversary of their trial, which was November 20th, 1720. And after that, I just started researching and writing more and more. And then eventually it just became my kind of passion. And well, here I am now as a historian after like 6 years.
And one of the fun things about Bonny and Reed is that if you try to research the actual solid verifiable history, there's a small amount of material, but it's just as much fun to research the history of the myth, because the mythologizing started very early on, after her trial.
That is correct. The actual amount of information you can actually put in that's verifiable, probably about under 1,000 words if I did a rough calculation. It's just a proclamation from 1720, September the 5th, I think is when that was issued by Woodes Rogers, the governor of the Bahamas, and the trial transcript, which was Jamaica 1720, November 28th. And that's about it. There's a few like scattered bits here and there, maybe a letter from like the governor of Jamaica, and that's about it. Uh, there's the burial record of Mary Read. That is objectively true, since it says pirate.
Mary Read the pirate.
Uh, yes, it says Mary Read pirate in the handwriting that is really difficult to read. So no, she was buried April 21st, 1721. That's objectively what happened, and that's it. That's it. Everything after that is speculation. The speculation actually honestly starts even before the better known A General History of the Pirates in 1724, because there will be newspaper articles you can find, I think, around 1721 that say stuff like, oh yes, the trial of Sarah Bonny, which I believe was a conflation of a Sarah Bonny who was on Jamaica, because anyway, they're already making conflations even in 1721. And then after 1721, more or less drops off because it was okay. This is actually a really weird thing about the trial. If you actually read it, no one seems to act like it's actually that special an event, even though it objectively is. There's only four female pirates of the Golden Age of piracy, 1630 through 1730. It's just Anne Bonny, Mary Read, a woman named Mary Critchett, who was an escaped prisoner from 1729, and Martha Farley, the wife of a pirate who was tried in 1726 and found innocent on the claim, well, I'm the wife, what was I supposed to do? That's it. Two female pirates being tried. Very unique event. No one acts like it, though. You read the trial transcript, it seems very blasé about it. You read the letters from Governor Nicholas Laws of Jamaica, he doesn't seem really that impressed. There is a book that was written in 1750, The Natural and Moral History of Jamaica, by like a guy named James Knight, who was a rich plantation owner. He only includes like, I don't know, a passing reference to Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and even you get a sentence or two more about John Rackham. So no one cares.
I'm going to slightly contradict you there, because when I was reading the newspaper excerpts that Jillian Molinar has on her website, it did feel like the presence of two women among this larger group of pirates was being highlighted. So, for example, there's a one where several men in Rackham's crew are listed, but then it specifically says and two women, blah blah blah. And I think the title of the trial record also specifically mentions them by name. I could be wrong on that.
You are correct. The official name of the trial is The Trial of John Rackham and Other Pirates, one paragraph down. The Trial of Anne Bonny and Mary Read.
So I get a sense that it was perceived as something of public interest that these two women were there.
It was public interest, yes, but it just simply, when you think about it, you think this would be like a media circus, but it's really not. You're also right that it was at least notable enough to generate interest to be written about, which not everyone in that trial got like a subhead.
And I would speculate, and I will specifically say it's speculation, that the very extensive biographies given of them in the general history is playing to that idea that the consuming public will be interested specifically in female pirates in the same way that in the 18th century the public was interested in stories of passing women and similar individuals. So
I agree.
I think that the fact that here are these two women who were pirates was not perceived as an unthinkable event, but it was perceived as something of pop culture interest, let's say.
Yeah, I agree with that. When I say like not interest, I mean more like the colonial area of like Jamaica and Barbados. When you get to London, oh no, that's when it does kind of become a bit of a media circus, because 1724, when general history is written, it was clearly written to capitalize on sensationalism and sell lots of copies, which pretty much did. The first edition actually doesn't do this. The first edition has like, general history, 5 paragraphs of a name, and then the names of the pirates. But starting in the second edition, Anne Bonny and Mary Read's name is about 2 or 3 times bigger in a text than even like Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts, people who were internationally well known. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, the news, I don't believe ever even really broke beyond the colonies. Might have at most the Boston Gazette mentioned it, but that's it. The Daily Jamaica Concurrent was the only major newspaper in Jamaica, and its publisher and editor was the guy who actually edited the trial transcript. That guy, I believe, his name was Baldwin. He was probably related to a really prominent family of printers in London who are also called the Baldwins. So that might have been how a copy of this newspaper got to London, and then whoever wrote General History of the Pirates, my guess probably being the editor Nathaniel Miss and people he contracted out, at least had the trial transcript, because I think it was the author Neil Rennie, when he wrote Treasure Neverland 2013, which is one of my favorite pirate books, by the way, notes that if you read a general history and then read the trial transcript, the phrasing is often almost plagiaristic.
Yeah, it's very clear that the general history incorporates the trial transcript very closely.
Yes, very much so. They're clinging to life on that one. So the writer had a copy of it. Unfortunately, there's only like 4 or 5 issues of the Jamaica Daily Concurrent that have survived. I suspect that there probably wouldn't be much of a mystery about what happened to Anne Bonny and Mary Read if the newspapers had survived, but we'll never know. But when the general history is written, yeah, the 2 chapters about Anne Bonny and Mary Read, they're unique even by that book standards, because most of the chapters are a captain of a ship, introduce the captain, and then explains the story. Some of it's accurate, some of it's not. It's very inconsistent, which is why I kind of tend to think multiple writers were involved in it. And Bonny and Mary Read are the only 2 pirates that are not captains in the book, and their chapters are the life of, not the career of, because they just starts with, so this is how they were conceived, this is how they were born, this is how they were raised, and then a lot of other gobbledygook, and then by the end, oh, here's their pirate career, which is really...
Yes, and as I pointed out, their early careers include massive quantities of detail that it would not be possible for a later writer to know.
Yes. A lot of the chapters in general history have inconsistent quality. The Bonny and Read chapters are closer in part to... Okay, a general history has 2 versions. There's volume 1, which everyone knows about, and then 1728 had a second volume, which that one added a few pirates, notably that were completely fictional, like the story of Libertalia and Captain Misson. That is completely fictional, and the general history chapters of Bonny and Reed are very much close to that in nature because the Anne Bonny one in particular is maddening. I think it's about 8 pages, and 4 of them are dedicated to a saga about silver spoons involving Anne Bonny's maid mother.
Yeah.
To put it mildly, this feels like padding and also feels just completely goofy. It's very theatrical, very London stage. It's cannot be taken seriously at all. Anyone who claims, "Oh, that happened," you didn't.
Or if it happened, it was somebody else's story entirely that's been lifted and incorporated. And that's what I feel about part of the Mary Read narrative is her adventures in the army in Flanders. That is very similar to a number of, female soldiers in disguise narratives that were popular at the time. And, one possibility is that this was, a true narrative about someone else that was lifted and incorporated and stuck under Mary Read's name.
Oh yeah, with Anne Bonny, I'm almost positive that mostly that's fictional. But with Mary Read, that's a more interesting one because it definitely feels like they're cribbing from a few people. Most notably, there was a woman named, I think, Christine Kavanagh, but everyone called her Mother Ross, who was famously a woman who did actually dress in male clothing and did fight in a European war and was pretty well known. There was a book that was written about her by Daniel Defoe, who is sometimes credited as the writer of general history. Probably wasn't, but that was written, I think, in the 1740s, but her story was pretty well known, well, long before that. So it's a fair assumption to believe that they're just cribbing from the book of another person.
Mhm.
But the complication with the war part is, I believe Christine Kavanagh was the War of Spanish Succession. But if you read the Mary Read chapter, it reads like Spanish Succession, but then at a point it just says, "Oh yeah, the Peace of Breswig." That's what ended the 9 Years' War. So
Yeah, and that really creates problems for her timeline because with that particular treaty as an anchor point, you then end up with like 20 years unaccounted for before she shows up as a pirate.
yes, like the book chapter says like, oh, peace, and then she then went to the Bahamas and was kidnapped by pirates. Yeah, in one sentence, we've gone about 20 years in the future, which is really these chapters are not very well written. The actual flow is really hard to follow. Like I've read the Anne Bonny chapter, attempted to many times over the years, and I have always had to fight the urge to just skip, skip, skip.
Yeah, I tried to construct a suggested timeline of the events, and there were a bunch of things in Anne Bonny's narrative, especially the material in the second edition, where this does not make sense as an actual timeline, which there's no reason it has to, but
Yeah.
but I kept trying.
The introduction for the Anne Bonny chapter, which is kind of like a introduction to both stories, says essentially, no, 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 trust me, this happened. This might sound like fiction, but trust me, hundreds of people were there. It happened. It's the only time where I think the author really starts talking to the audience.
It's very much the kind of plot that you find in farces of that era.
Yes, exactly. And there's another bit that's a bit more farcical that very much matters down the road as well, which they do. They both have cross-dressing elements to their story, although I think it's the John Rackham chapter for that's where it mentions casually that Anne Bonny and Mary Read kind of fall in love with each other, but it's like a confusing ooh twist. Actually, they were women, and they both kind of like disappointed by this. It's a switcheroo, which is once again very very London playwright-esque. It's just a way for the audience to go, "Ha, that's funny," or "Yeah, imagine."
Again, that's a pop culture motif is with all of the the saucy sailor boy ballads and things where typically you would have a story where like the cross-dressing woman as a sailor is come on to by the ship captain's wife or something, and then you get the reveal of oh gosh, you're a woman, so ha ha ha, of course I wasn't actually attracted to you. And it's very much in that same line.
Yeah, it's the 18th century equivalent of the not gays. Ooh,
Yeah.
that's the story. But they guess okay, one was dressed as a man, we're gonna fall in love, and they're tough pirates for a long period of time, and then they get captured, and then John Rackham gets executed, and then those two plead their bellies, and Mary Read dies in prison, and then Anne Bonny. The most honest part of the entire chapter is literally the last paragraph where the writer says, "What happened to her? He doesn't even try to speculate, which is bizarre to me. Also, that you actually even read the chapter, you can immediately tell the part where it cuts off and becomes child transcript because it's very vague dates. And then September of 1720, it just starts throwing dates in there. So
it occurs to me that at the time the general history was first published, it was not all that long after the trial. If
4 years.
the author had made claims about what happened to Anne after the trial, there was a reasonable possibility she might pop up and say, no, that's not what happened. I mean, I'm again, we're fantasizing here, but
what she did afterwards, if she was when she was let go, is anyone's guess.
So we have this one little incident within this narrative, and the narratives in the general history of the pirates are very strongly emphasizing that both of these women have heterosexual relationships. They both have something like marriages, multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
And so this one, pseudo sapphic encounter is a very small part of that, but it has now been greatly enlarged in the modern imagination now that it's no longer a teehee, let's imagine this and then negate it. And one of the things that inspired me to do this episode is the wealth of modern lesbian historical novels about pirates that take up that theme of Anne and Mary were lovers. And you have some thoughts on how and when that started.
Okay. But you're absolutely correct though. They do emphasize marriage with men multiple times in that chapter. They mention offhandedly, "Oh, Mary Read was married to some Flemish soldier who then died," and also had an unnamed lover who was on Rackham ship. And then with Anne Bonny, oh, she was the lover of a sailor who they clarify in a later was the appendices that it was someone named James Bonny, and then she was also in love with John Rackham. So yeah, they're very heterosexually like front loading that almost in a way to get around to don't think that was anything beyond a joke, but that thought clearly continued to appear anyway because the first actual mention of lovers between the two straight up is from a 1725 book called The History and Lives of Notorious Pirates, and it's essentially a plagiarized ripoff of a general history, which was a very common thing. This book is a condensed version of a general history, and when it gets to the Mary Read and Anne Bonny trial, it just speeds on through it, and it has one sentence, and I wrote this down, a sentence that is very ambiguously phrased. It was impossible for a woman to be guilty of what they swore against her, and that she entered into the service of the privateer purely upon the account of Anne Bonny, who was her lover, being sensible. If she had not put herself into disguise, she could not have been admitted on board the ship. That one sentence is doing a lot of lifting. That could be either read as a condensed version of the accidental falling in love bit from a general history. It could just be a writing error, or it could be exactly what it sounds like, which is playing to perhaps audiences. Ooh, two girls there, they would love each other. Oh, wow. It's unclear which it is and how popular that claim was afterwards. I'm not sure because you actually will not find anyone repeating that until 1813 when you get to a chapbook that was called The Extraordinary Adventures and Daring Exploits of Captain Henry Morgan, which there are copies that exist, but they go for thousands of dollars. So boy, do I not have one of those. But from what I can gather, I think it's more or less just a condensed version of History and Lives. So rip off of a rip off. In the 19th century, you do start to actually see this pop up a few times, mostly in like the 1890s. It gets kind of strange, actually. Like the first one off the top of my head would be The Naval History of the United States by Willis J. Abbott. That was a book from 1896. That one mostly talking about like piracy in like the 1600s. So it's talking about like William Kidd and Henry Every. But when it's talking about Madagascar, it just offhandedly goes on a weird tangent about, oh, well, Madagascar, many pirates. I like those two female pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who were lovers, and their feelings were mutually reciprocated. And then back to just William Kidd, I don't know why the author did that, but and then like 3 years later, you had The Buccaneers and Their Reign of Terror by C.M. Stevens in 1899. That one, in passing, just kind of goes, well, those two female pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, they fell in love and really loved each other. And it's like a thing that writers just throw in passing. It's like a minute detail. And then, okay, the actual major notable one is the great Magnus Hirschfeld, the sexologist. He wrote a book in 1914 that was called, like, oh, when we have the phrasing here, The Homosexuality of Men and Women. That one, he mentions throw example of, okay, historical examples of homosexual couple, and then just says Anne Bonny, Mary Read, no lead in, no real context, and then just kind of moves on to the next person. It's notable since he's an academic person. He's not just writing this book for the fun of writing. And then you gotta get all the way until the 1970s for this to become a concept again. And by that point, it then expands exponentially and never looks back. And that was a 1972 article by a woman named Susan Baker called Anne Bonny and Mary Read, They Killed Pricks. Period. End of statement. That is the title. It's I think like a 5-page piece in an article for the newspaper The Furies for the Furies Collective, which was a political lesbian commune in DC from 1970 to I think 1974. I think it's in the second issue of the newspaper. And yeah, it just very aggressively, these two were lovers. Everyone who says they weren't lovers are lying. You're lying. It's very accusatory. Uh, Baker probably was quoting a 1964 romance novel called Mistress of the Seas, which is a very softcore erotic novel by John Karlova that it doesn't say they were lovers, but it does take the scene where they fall in love and very much eroticize it more, where it's like, oh no, there's lots of heaving, hooving breasts, and it's very, very sexy, and then oh no, they're no, they get married to men. Well, this is that minus. I do know after talking with a woman who did actually know Susan Baker, or a woman in Baltimore named Sandra Covey, that this wasn't an uncommon opinion in feminist and queer circles in the 60s and 70s that Bonny and Reed were lovers. They wouldn't write about it openly in newsletters or books. It was just a commonly assumed belief of, well, two female pirates on the same ship, so we'll just assume things.
Yeah, and that was an era when I've seen it referred to as naming and claiming, when the emergent gay pride movement was very much invested in identifying historical figures as gay. I mean, gay and lesbian, but we just called it all gay back then.
Yes.
And so, there was a lot of this. And of course, it was all very unfootnoted. But any hint that there might have been a same-sex relationship, and it's like, yes, one of us, one of us.
Yeah, a good example of that would be people who claimed James Buchanan, 15th president, was gay because he didn't actually have a wife, and he did write letters to a friend that were very not erotic, but very personal. But no, you're right. There was a lot of claiming and sometimes on very flimsy evidence, but it was, done to legitimize a movement. So I fully understand it. Okay, the way this actually becomes mainstream is bizarre. So her article, and by Mary, They Killed Pricks, that article was published in a book in 1974 called like Forgotten Women that was edited by Nancy Myron, one of the Fury members. That got sent around a few places. Somehow that ended up in London, and a London playwright named Stephen Gooch was found it, and he used that alongside Mistress of the Seas to write a play called Women Pirates, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, 1978. Decent hit, and it toned down the queerness, but it's certainly still there. And then after that, the idea of Anne Bonny and Mary being lovers more or less escapes containment, and you start seeing it show up in, well, lots of erotic novels in the 80s, academic works, normal books, and then when you get to the 2000s, you start getting into, okay, TV, video games, arts, paintings, exhibitions, and that trend continues to the very end.
And now here we are today with, at least a dozen lesbian pirate novels coming out every year. And maybe half of them are specifically invoking Anne Bonny and Mary Read as characters in some way.
Yeah, I'd say about half of them name them by, specifically say this is Anne Bonny or Mary Read. It's broken down to usually, okay, we have the dark-haired Mary Read and the red-headed Irish Anne Bonny, which, that's a couple fetish things for some people. But yeah, there's a lot of erotic novels in the 80s and 90s that are just, and then Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and then they make out very much so, and that's it. And then there's like 1980s, there's comic books that are being made. I think one was the Witchblade, I think one was called. Where it's, oh, here's a very eroticized, artistic drawing of Anne Bonny saving Mary Read, and ooh, we're gonna fight crime and craziness like that. That was an actual comic
Fight
book.
crime, huh?
Yeah, I
Just to
know.
do crime.
Yeah. Actually, not even the first comic. The actual first comic to mention Anne Bonny and Mary Read was like something from the 40s where they looked like characters from like Riverdale. Like, I, no, I'm not kidding. I'm pretty sure the character model was straight up a ripoff of like just Veronica. Uh, Also, oddly enough, that comic is where the Mary Read's like fake male name comes from because the general history does not make any note about her using like a persona name beyond she's dressed as a man. But we're back to the 90s. 90s when it gets really, really noticeable. There's multiple stories emphasizing, oh, they were lovers. I was like, there was one called like Mary Read the Buccaneer, and it's like, oh, this long, long, loving romance story about how she falls in love with like a female sailor not named Anne Bonny, and how oh, they caress each other every night, snuggle in bed while she has a big library, and it just historians mostly didn't kind of bring it up that much. I know the famous book Beneath the Black Flag by David Cordingly doesn't really mention anything about the two falling in love beyond the general history, shenanigans. But that's historians. When it comes to writers, oh yeah, by the 2000s, it's popping up all the time. And sometimes in interesting ways. There's a 2005 novel called Kingston by Starlight that explicitly makes Mary Read transgender, which is
Hmm.
I think that's very forward thinking, very interesting, especially for 2005.
A couple others that take that sort of tactic, not necessarily for Mary Read, but within a pirate context where the cross-dressing aspect is framed more as transgender identity.
The Kingston by Starlight. That's probably the first actual use of Mary Read in a transgender format. Not the last, but definitely the first. Although the video game Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, which is probably one of the most successful and notable depictions of Anne Bonny and Mary Read, piracy in general, kind of almost goes in that direction. It never says it, but the way they write that character just reads to me as very transcoded. Because in that game, Mary Read is playing like a fictional bastard son of William Kidd, going by name James, and like the way the character talks has a very almost feminine sort of edge to it when it's in the male persona, but when the characters are going to be Mary Read, the voice becomes very almost masculine, and the characters around her kind of talk like, "Well, I knew you as a good friend, but I just don't know you anymore." And it just I don't know, it just reads to me as very transcoded, but that could be just myself, and I know the writers have never ever said anything on that direction. Just feels like they were going in that direction.
So what we're seeing, across the centuries is a theme of people who fictionalize the lives of Bonny and Read, fictionalize them through the filters of their own era. So even as we get, the more modern fiction about them, each version is being interpreted through the lens of that era. And of course, this is a truism that everyone who writes historic fiction is actually writing about their contemporary experience. But it's a fascinating illustration of that principle, that interpreting these two women and their presentation and their reception by their cultures is consistently being reinterpreted in light of the author's own context and the social issues of the day.
Oh, absolutely. That is a truth going back to their founding in 1724. With the general history, the vibe is again just come hither, look at the unique specimens in a very carnival barky manner. And then when you get to the 1800s and the Victorian era, there's some very weird moralizing going on about, okay, well, Mary Read's cross-dressing, and that's not great. But Anne Bonny's kind of a harlot, so we're gonna judge her a lot more. And it becomes this weird And Bonnie's the bad one. Mary Reed's the good one. But we're not going to depict both of them on stage because women wearing men's clothing. No, 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 no. And then once we kind of get further into the 1900s, that starts to change. It's kind of strange because Mary Reed from around 1724 all the way till 1940s, she is the more important person. People will go out of the way to say Mary Reed's fascinating, inspirational. She fought for love and romance and did the right thing, and then tragically died. Cross-dressing wasn't great, but lots of good things. The other one, it's oh no, it's the harlot who left her husband to join a pirate, and over and over and over again
Well,
until the night.
that comes directly out of the general history.
Oh yeah, it's like that
Absolutely
too.
frames them as the bad girl and the not so bad girl.
It does, yes. The emphasizing of being a former soldier who fought for king and country is definitely in general history, although that becomes more pronounced in the Victorian age. When we get to the 1930s, it then swaps to Anne Bonny's more popular than Mary Read, and that has been that way since. And I kind of put that down to the power of cinema, since when you get to the 1930s, you get started getting these swashbuckler films, Captain Blood, Spanish Main. Spanish Main actually has Mary Read show up, or Anne Bonny, and okay, well, what looks good in Technicolor? Bright flowing red hair. So when you have Maureen O'Hara being like the heroine, like, okay, that sticks out more. And you start running into the Hays Code where, okay, you look at the female depiction of pirates, they're very wearing like, bodices, corsets, very dressy. They're not wearing sailor slop for the most part, because I know that the Hays Code looked down and went, we can allow this, but we have to make it clear that this is a woman who is wearing women's clothing and will be the lover of the main character. And, if they don't do that, then at least have them die so that you get the message that this is bad. And Mary Reed's character is entirely on cross-dressing. Nah, we're just gonna cut her. She's not gonna be in any of these movies. Just Anne Bonny. And by the time the 60s comes around with Hands of the Hays Code, swashbuckling subgenre, that's dead too. So there's not much time to make up for it. And by the 1960s, romance is a bigger part of me and Bonnie's story, so that's now the focus. And yeah, until like Assassin's Creed 4, Mary Reed's been like a side character at best, or even just completely jettisoned. Even Black Flag, the pirate show, has Mary Reed show up for 2 seconds in the end, but Anne Bonny's been a consistent main character since episode 1. But yeah, Black Flag, that's the biggest swan song for Mary Reed in about a century. And it's one that makes her kind of queer. And that also makes her, maybe because of the fact that she's a more tossed to the side character, that she starts to garner a bit more of a queer following than Anne Bonny by comparison.
So let's bring it up to the present day. What do you have to say about the very contemporary fictional depictions?
Contemporary depictions seem to go both ways, which was okay. They tend to always go in the more actiony girl sort of direction. I kind of call it just a female pirate like trope, which tends to be she's pretty, she's actiony, she's deadly, she's sometimes the hero, sometimes the lover, occasionally queer, but that's not the main focus. Assassin's Creed 4 with Mary Ann Bonny, she's just the love interest character for John Rackham and like a friend in the main game. They don't make her queer. And again, it's like queerness with Mary Reed. Black Sails, the TV show, goes in the direction of Anne Bonny is bisexual, which, as far as I'm aware, is actually the only depiction in that direction. Usually she's either straight or she's just queer. She's not usually in between as bi. That was unique. The most recent major depiction of them was probably the Our Flag Means Death show, which was explicitly a queer pirate show. Did not queer bait, was very blatantly honest about that. But that show had a strange thing. They had a character who was explicitly a Mary Reed stand-in, and then they just had Anne Bonny Mary Reed show up later. That they had a character that was they thought it was a male pirate, and then showed revealed to be a woman, but then that character says they're kind of in between, so non-binary. And that character goes by Jim the whole series. And then Mary and Anne Bonny show up as lovers in the last season as like a Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf kind of dysfunctional relationship, which I have not seen that before when it comes to depictions of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Most depictions tend to be like the Bonnie and Clyde, or I guess Bonnie and Claudia here, like relationship of the bad girl romance going against the law, or like some sort of really almost lovey-dovey, sweet, loving relationships, having them be kind of awful. I expect in the future they're probably going to continue to do more queer romance stories with Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Would not be surprised to see more depictions of Mary Read as a trans man, since transgender topics are a much bigger discussion now than in 2005. So that would probably check out more novel form where you can self-publish. Television with piracy, I don't foresee it becoming more subjects, since Our Flag Means Death that got canceled because of its cost, and TV show cost with pirate shows was going to be pretty high. Movie wise, I know Pirates of the Caribbean. They keep saying they want to keep bringing it back. They say it every year. I'll believe it when I see it. I know at one point they did actually write not a script, but just a general idea of a sixth Pirates of the Caribbean film with Anne Bonny as the main character, and it was going to be Margot Robbie at one point. Rumors last year were, the actress that was in that TV show, The Bear, maybe she'll play a character that's loosely based on Anne Bonny. Video game wise, that one I'm very curious about because pirate video games, the biggest one that's been released is probably Skull and Bones, which doesn't actually have an overt Anne Bonny character. The Black Flag remake, that's this year, which actually they did. The rumor about that game is that they're going to expand aspects of Anne Bonny, Mary Reed's character. Oh, there was a statue of them made back in 2020 for a podcast that was called Hellcast, which was a loose adaptation of Mistress of the Seas, except it actually did make them openly lovers. Basically, my assumption is these two characters are going to remain popular forever. Anne Bonny probably will be more popular than Mary Reed because of the Irish connection, because of the assumption about red hair, and because she's been in more things at this point than Mary Reed. Mary Reed will probably always be the sidekick, except for occasional stories that are focusing on her, which will probably be more overtly queer. There'll be more lesbian relationships. There'll be people who try to straight wash them. There will be more trans topics. There will be just transgressions in general, since they're pirates. That's a transgression. They're female pirates. It's a double transgression. It just kind of goes hand in hand.
So let's switch over to you as a creative individual. What sorts of projects do you have going that our audience might like to hear about?
Well, I have quite a few at the moment. I do have two papers going on about Anne Bonny and Mary Reed. One more about their identity history, which actually is briefly what this topic was kind of even based around, about from 1724 to 2024, for a Polish history quarter called like Studia Herzia. And the second one is for World History Connect, about the origins of Anne Bonny and Mary Reed. On the other hand, I do actually have a documentary in production about not female piracy, but it is maritime themed, about the steamer SS Eastland, which was a ship built in 1903 in Michigan, and that rolled over in the Chicago River in 1915, killing 844 people. It's technically the worst shipping disaster in the Great Lakes history and the worst disaster in Chicago history. And it's been a thing I've been obsessed with since I was a child. Mostly the main character is a woman named Helen Repa, who is my namesake, actually. So in a way, this documentary is honoring this forgotten heroic nurse who helped save hundreds of lives in 1915 and never got much respect.
And if people want to follow you on social media, assuming you wish to be followed, where should they look?
I'm on Bluesky most of the time. It's I believe I'm just going by Helen Rodriguez, like Lady Helen Bio Rodriguez. Also Mastodon, also Facebook, and Reddit. Reddit still has my old name, but if you just type in like Anne Bonny, bad history, Reddit, you'll find my post and you can follow me. My email is helenrodriguez1720@gmail.com. I have no problem with talking with anybody about this topic, honestly. Anybody can just come to me and go, so what do you think about so-and-so topic? And I'll say, well, I can give you a long answer, and I'm not going to dismiss anybody. I just love people who find this topic interesting.
Okay, well, I will put links to those in the show notes. And yes, thank you so much for coming on the show.
No problem, Heather. It was a great joy.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast. See the show notes for links to people and topics. Most shows will have a transcript linked as well. If you have a book announcement, a topic suggestion, or might like to appear on the show, please drop me an email. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate it and subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and consider supporting our Patreon.